In this video, we're going to take a look at managing and migrating the 5 FSMO roles, the Flexible Single Master of Operations roles that happen when you have more than one domain controller in a domain or in a forest. So in this situation, I have Server 1 and Server 2, which are both Active Directory domain controllers on the test domain that I've created. Now, sometimes the time comes for you to decommission a domain controller. It's normally not something that happens right away, but you may need to decommission one after several years when maybe you have a new version of Windows that you want to install as your domain controller, or simply the hardware isn't keeping up, or you just decide that it's that time to get rid of the old and in with the new. So what we can do is we can take a look at those FSMO roles and we can look to migrate them to a new server before we demote a server from a domain controller. Now, another thing you might choose to do is you might just move these roles around because you want to balance things out between different domain controllers. Different domain controllers might be better suited for certain roles than others. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a look at the different utilities we can use to move the domain-specific roles first. Now, Server 1 was the first domain controller installed, so it automatically will get all 5 roles. Server 2 was installed later on, and I might want to move some of the roles to that other server. So I'm going to go into Tools and Active Directory Users and Computers. Now, it might not be the most logical place to find these particular tools, but this is where you would go to manage them. Now, since I'm in Active Directory Users and Computers, I don't exactly know which server I'm talking to unless I take a look at this tool here, and it says that the focus of this Active Directory Users and Computers snap-in is talking to Server 2. Now, it's important to talk to the destination server that you want to move the role to. If you need to change that server, you can right-click on this and say Change Domain Controller, but make sure that the focus is on the server that you want to move the role to. Okay, so in order to do this, I'm going to right-click on my domain and I'm going to say Operations Masters. These are the FSMO roles that Windows has for some specific purposes. Now, there's 3 of them here at the domain level. And right now the Operations Master is Server 1. Because my focus is on Server 2, Server 2 is listed down here. So if I want to go from Server 1 to Server 2, I can click Change. If I wanted to go to some other server, I need to change the focus of this utility by right-clicking on Active Directory Users and Computers and choosing Select Domain Controller, or Change Domain Controller. So let's talk a little bit about these roles. The RID role has to do with making sure you're handing out unique identifiers for new objects that get created. Let's say, for example, I had Server 1 and Server 2, and they're at different locations, and there's administrators creating user accounts at both locations. We want to make sure that the unique identifier that's used to create these accounts isn't used in 2 places. So the RID master role hands out blocks of addresses. 500 addresses at once to each domain controller. So the unique identifier that Server 1 might be handing out might be 1 to 500. The unique identifier that Server 2 is handing out would be 501 to 1000. That way, even if they're creating users at the exact same moment, they're still creating unique users because the unique IDs that are handed out by this role won't conflict. So some server has to do this. Some server has to manage it. It's not a super busy role. It doesn't take a lot of resources or anything like that, but it needs to be something that's relatively highly available. You need to make sure it's online most of the time. Once you make 500 users, you're going to need a new block of RIDs, relative IDs. But if it's off from time to time, it's not a deal breaker. It just means you might need to create user accounts on a different server once in a while. Another catch to this is if you ever have to seize this role without moving it gracefully, You never want to bring that original domain controller back online. We don't want two servers thinking they're the RID master at once. If they both thought they were the RID master, they might hand out the same IDs to different servers, and then you have all kinds of conflicts on your domain. So this is one you want to be pretty careful with, and try to only move it gracefully. Unless a server really is failed for good, you probably don't want to move this server, this particular FSMO role, just trivially. I'm going to move it to server 2 to show you how to do it. I'm going from server 1 to server 2, and I will change the role. Are you sure you want to transfer the role? Now all it's doing is saying there's a new responsible party for this role, so the process happens pretty much instantaneously. On server 1, we can look at the utility as well, and it will admit that server 2 is now in charge of this role. Just for kicks, I'm going to change my focus back to server 1 in this utility, and I'm going to move that role back. I can go into Operations Masters. Currently the Operations Master for the RID role is server 2, but my focus is on server 1, so I can change it back. And it transfers very easily as long as both domain controllers are online at the same time. And both domain controllers were able to boot up cleanly and synchronize with other domain controllers at that boot process. The next role is the PDC Emulator role. Only one domain controller in the domain can be this role. This role is quite important for any of the old PDC functions from the old pre-Windows 2000 era. So back in the NT days, we had one domain controller that was a read-write copy, and we had a bunch of read-only domain controllers, effectively. And the PDC was really the master of all of this. And you'd switch this PDC between different servers if something was offline or whatever. But for the most part, it was responsible for a couple of important things. One is time management on your domain. All domain controllers get their time from the PDC emulator. All client machines and member servers get their time from the domain controller they sign on to. So the PDC emulator is the only machine on the entire domain that should be synchronized with time from any external source. Everybody else is going to get their time from an internal source to ensure that all of the time on the network remains consistent. You can move this role as well, the same process as we did before. Change the focus of your utility so that this will change to that server that's focused, and click change. It's very simple to do. As a matter of fact, I'll move this one as well, just to show you how easy it is to move this when both servers are online. So now, I moved the RID master. I should be a lot more careful when moving these types of roles. But I'll move the PDC emulator as well. This isn't something to be done as trivially as I just did, so just make sure you look at these screens 2 or 3 times before you make these clicks. They are important decisions to the real insides of Active Directory. The other thing that PDC Emulator is responsible for is password changes. Password changes need to happen instantaneously throughout the domain. So it's important to send these password changes to one particular device, and then from there they are propagated out to all the other devices in a very fast fashion. We don't want to have a difference of opinion on what the password is for a particular account. So the PDC emulator is always that password source. PDC emulator should usually be always set in the busiest location of your organization. If you have a headquarters, or you have a site that has more users than anybody else, that's probably the best place for your PDC emulator. We also have an infrastructure master. Infrastructure master helps us understand objects that are not in our domain. So if I had a multi-domain environment, the infrastructure master can help me understand the IDs that are tied to other user accounts and group accounts on other domains, in case I'm sharing resources between my domains. I have another video that discusses some of the group options when you're creating groups in Active Directory. And whenever you have a group that is jumping from one domain to another, like a global group or a universal group, you're going to need to be able to understand those objects. So in case they get their name changed or group memberships change on that other domain, we need to be updated. And the infrastructure master is actually responsible for those interdomain operations. Only one server on the domain performs the role, and this one is probably the easiest one to flip around if you need to flip it around. But there is one catch to this. If you have a multi-domain environment, this role has a purpose. If you have a single domain environment, this role does nothing. But if you have a multi-domain environment, you don't want the infrastructure master to be on a global catalog server. And here's why. The global catalog server already has all of those records, and it'll never sense any changes for the infrastructure master role to update. So either have every domain controller in your forest also as a global catalog server, or make sure the infrastructure master is not a global catalog server. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to switch the infrastructure master role to server 2. And even though I have a single domain environment, I'm going to undo the global catalog server option on server 2 so that the infrastructure master role is never a global catalog server. It's a good practice. I don't know how big this domain is going to grow, so I need to be prepared for the future. So typically my second domain controller becomes the infrastructure master and is not a global catalog server, even though that's how I set it up initially. So I'm going to jump in there and go in and make the change so that my second server is not a global catalog. I make that change in the Active Directory Sites and Services utility. This is another one of those roles, though, that if you ever have to seize back control of the infrastructure master role, it's not that big of a deal. If one of your servers is down and you need to flip that role really quickly and you need to seize that role, that's going to be okay. It's normally not any problem at all. It's the RID master so far that is the one that you wouldn't want to bring back online if you seize that role. So I'm going to go into default first site name. It's my default first site that I've created, or actually it was created for me. And I'm going to go into server 2. Since I set server 2 to be an infrastructure master, I'm going to go into NTDS settings, and I'm going to right click and go to properties. And I'm going to uncheck it as a global catalog server. I'm going to tell it not to be a global catalog server anymore, because it's the infrastructure master. Server 1 is still a global catalog server, as it should be. But that way, no matter how many more servers I add, whether they're global catalog or not, I won't have to worry about this conflict if I do step into a situation where I have multiple domains. We'll come back to Active Directory Sites and Services in a later video where I'll explain exactly what sites are all about and why they're so cool. The next thing we're going to take a look at is, well, actually, I think we've finished our domain-specific infrastructure and PDC and RID roles. So we're going to take a look at another role that is forest-wide. Only one server in the entire forest gets to be in charge of this role. So if I go into the Active Directory Domains and Trusts utility, I can right-click, I right-click actually on my utility at the top of the utility, and I can go to the Operations Master. I don't right-click on a domain because it's not a domain-specific role. It's a forest-wide role. So this top level here kind of represents the forest. And there's the Operations Master option. And because the focus is on server 2 for this particular utility, I can switch from the default, in my case, the first domain controller, server 1, and I can move this role over to server 2. This is called the domain naming master, the domain naming operations master. And what its job is if you ever had a situation where two administrators on different sides of your network create a new domain at the exact same moment, this server is there to handle that conflict. Microsoft really thought of everything when they created this domain naming master role. So this only needs to be online when that moment arises where you're adding domains to your forest. And its only real responsibility is to make sure that you don't create two domains at the exact same time in the same forest. So that's the job here. I'm going to change that role just for kicks. It jumps over there, and only one server is going to have this in your entire forest. And if you have to seize this role and move it back later, it's not a big deal. This one is only responsible for creating domains, and frankly, if it's unavailable, the only thing you're going to lose out on is the ability to make a new domain. This has to be online at the moment you make a new domain. You could shut it down right after that, and it's not going to affect your new domain that's created. It's only during that process of making that domain. So, super small, tiny role, doesn't do a whole lot almost all the time, but when it needs to be there, it needs to be there. And there is one more role that we need to take a look at. It's a forest-wide role, and it is the Schema Master role. But in order to get this one to work, we actually have to install a new Active Directory Schema snap-in utility. So we need to add in a new DLL that's not in there by default. So let me just open up an MMC. Just right-click, go to Run, and type MMC. We get a blank console with no utilities in it yet. And if I go in to Add Remove Snap-in, you'll notice there is nothing called Active Directory Schema. And the Active Directory Schema is the GUI, the graphical user interface, that we would use to manage the Active Directory Schema and the Operations Master. So there's a command we can run to make this work, and it is regsvr32, like registry server 32, schmmgmt.dll. Reg server 32 space schmmgmt.dll. And when we hit enter here, the DLL register service loads in this new DLL. And now I can add and remove snap-in, and the Active Directory Schema utility will be available to me. I can add that into my console. I could add in other stuff if I wanted to create a mega console that has all the utilities that I want to work with. But for today, I'm just going to set up the Active Directory Schema, and I'll say OK. Active Directory Schema, when I click on it, it actually connects up to a server. And in this case, the Active Directory Schema is connecting to server 1 because server 1 is the Schema Master. So the Schema Master is kind of a neat role. It's the only device on the forest that's allowed to change the schema. And the schema is the rules for all of the different classes and those classes' attributes. So for example, in this list somewhere is the definition for what a user is, the definition for what a group is, the definition for what a domain controller is, etc., etc. Because Active Directory is just a big database. So you can think of this as the definitions of what exists in the Active Directory database. This one's very important, and this is not one that you would want to seize after the fact if you had a server off for a while, and then you seize that role to some other server. You don't want to bring that original one back online because it could be bringing in old changes and declaring itself the Schema Master, and you'd have a conflict. Only one server can actually be the read-write copy of the schema, the definition of what Active Directory has in it. So in order to change this one, the first thing I need to do is I need to change the domain controller so that the focus of this utility is on server 2. It needs to be online, obviously. Now, what it says is the Active Directory schema snap-in is not connected to the Schema Master, so I can't actually make any changes here. I can only make schema changes to the FSMO role holder, the Schema Master. But I had to switch to server 2 in order to pull that operations master over. So now if I choose the operations master option here, and I have my current schema master here, the destination schema master is here, I can click change and say yes, and the operations master is successfully transferred. And now the only read-write copy of the schema is server 2. So that is the 5 FSMO roles and how to change them with the GUI. All of those roles can also be changed through PowerShell, through the command prompt as well, but I tend to prefer the GUI. If you are interested, you could do a quick Google search and find out how to change those from the command prompt as well. One more thing that I think is worthy to show before I sign off here is, what if we do have a situation where the server is unavailable and I need to steal a role? I'm going to steal that infrastructure master role. So I'm going to go back into my operations masters and I'm going to see that server 2 is currently the infrastructure master for my network. I'm going to jump over onto server 1. And actually, while I'm at it, I'm going to unplug server 2 from my network. So now server 1 and server 2 are not talking to each other. But on server 1, let's pretend server 2 is broken and I really need that infrastructure master available. I can go into Active Directory users and computers. The focus of the utility will be on server 1. And I can go in and look at my operations masters. You'll notice a pause. And that's because it's trying to communicate to server 2, which is actually the operations master for the RID, PDC, and infrastructure right now. It's trying to communicate and make sure that it can talk to those and possibly transfer the role for me. But instead, it's trying and trying and trying, and eventually it's going to time out and it's going to show an error when it goes to look for who the operations master role holder is. But that's okay. In this particular test, I want it to error out. I want to show what happens if that server is not available. Now I don't want to mess with the RID master. That one's pretty critical. But if I go and take a look at the infrastructure master, this is one that I can move back and forth, and it makes a perfect test for forcing the seizing of a role from one server to another. It's not something that I would recommend doing intentionally in a production environment, seizing roles. But if you move roles back and forth, it's not usually that big of a deal. As long as you end up placing them optimally, you'll be in good shape. So this pause, it takes 20 seconds or so for it to time out and give up on trying to communicate to the real infrastructure master. And here it is. The current operations master is in a state of error, but I can change that operations master to server 1. If I click change, it says, "Are you sure?" and I say yes. It's trying to communicate again. It really wants to do this cleanly. It does not want to have to force this role from one server to another. Only as a last-ditch effort should this be done. But in a test environment, it's kind of nice to see what would happen if it was a disaster. It tries, and it tries, and it tries, and eventually it will give up. While we're waiting for that, it's kind of interesting to see that when I pulled the global catalog piece away from server 2 before, it did change my DC type from a GC to a DC. It's not a global catalog, it's simply a domain controller. It does take a moment, and It should. It should be trying and trying and trying to connect in any way it can. And then I get an error. The requested FSMO operation failed. I could not transfer this role nicely. So since I can't contact it, under some circumstances, a forced transfer can be performed. Do I want to attempt a forced transfer? Yes. The role was successfully transferred, and now the infrastructure master is server 1. Now, let's see what happens when I plug in server 2 again. I'll plug it back into its virtual switch so it comes back online. And it's normally a good practice when you're changing things around, close out and reopen your utilities. I find that things like Active Directory users and computers don't always refresh very well. So now on server 2, I can go in and take a look at those operations masters. The RID master is still server 2. The PDC Emulator is still server 2. And the infrastructure master is server 1. When server 2 came back online, it was absolutely fine relinquishing control of that particular operations master. So there you have it. That is the transferring of FSMO roles, an overview of what all those FSMO roles are there for, and even seizing a role and seeing what happens when we seize a role and then bring an original server back online. Key thing here, don't seize the role and bring a server back online for RID or the Schema Master. Those are the two dangerous ones where you never want to bring that original server back online when the role has been seized from it.